Lied to us.
Is it more than 5 minutes? I lie constantly. Constantly.
I was going to say, when you did that at husband, what was
It was less a lie than a hopeful mentioning.
I know.
Okay.
How was our air quality measured?
Let's say that we meet on the wrong side.
Oh no!
This is Beloit.
Okay.
This is Manitowoc. So you can see that we are far above.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yes, where we need to be.
Feel that?
Okay. You guys were okay
Yeah.
for a few hours.
But not
3 days
that's
ago.
why I'm like wheezing half the time, right?
Yes.
That's why
Okay.
we're masked outside sometimes. Okay. There we go.
Yeah, there it is. That's right. Black Mining Plus.
No, we might have to redo the screens because sometimes it's super finicky.
It might be okay. Give it a moment.
Oh, yeah.
It's the text.
Oh, it's going on 1. So if you could,
And there it is.
but it's only on 1.
Only one. So
If you could clip this
okay.
somewhere like tie, collar, it's really for, or under, yeah, it's for online.
Okay.
What does it say? I'm gonna turn it off and turn it all back on. Okay.
Oh, you know what? I'm doing it wrong. There it is. There it is.
There you go. Yeah, I figured you didn't need a mic for the room.
Okay, it's up to you. I think I can project my voice.
Well, there's never been a problem before. If it turns out people are like, well, what? I'll grab you a mic.
Okay.
So. As usual, I'll do a couple announcements beforehand.
Yeah.
And if you cannot stray too far from this,
Yes. Okay. Remember
you have
that.
about a foot on each side.
Okay. This is my limit.
As soon as we have everything set, I'm going to go start the broadcast. Yeah, for sure.
It's happened gone in 3 hours.
Yep.
Sorry, don't think I need it. But just
That way, to the right.
to the right.
Give it a sec. He's warming up again.
I think, yes. Okay.
Both at least similar.
Everyone got so quiet.
I know, because
They're optimistic about Optima.
cross the finger. Searching.
See, normally it's that screen that's problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, we are. Tell you what I'm gonna do.
Hold tight, everyone. A lecture really is coming. This wasn't just a ploy to get you here this evening. But please enjoy the quick trip coffee while you're here.
Yeah, that was good.
That one's coming.
Okay, now that one's coming.
This might not be something you can resolve. Max told me that it was the one thing that was happening weird. It's kind of what it is, I think. I don't know. I don't know if I can get it going.
Should we encourage something?
He had to restart the whole system before.
Yeah,
And it wasn't.
I'm gonna try shutting it off and turning it on one more time. And I mean, if it
Okay.
doesn't work, I mean,
Every bite she takes. It's like our purple.
May I displace you for a second? I have to step into the camera. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. It's great to have everyone back in room for Great Decisions after 2 years of craziness. As you can see, it's just a different kind of craziness now, but at least it's in-room craziness. I just wanted to make a couple of announcements before I turn it over to Professor Toral. Just a reminder to everyone, next week's lecture on climate migration is exclusively online. There will be no in-room presentation next week, but that is the only one. Otherwise, everything will be both in-room and online. And I usually have more announcement, but since we're getting started very late, I will just cut to the chase and thank our sponsors and then turn it over to Professor Toral. So, our sponsors for Great Decisions are the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and Lakeshore Pax Christi, and Quick Trip. So, if I could get a big round of applause for all of our sponsors. And you certainly didn't come here to hear me talk, so without further ado, Professor Pablo Toral.
Thank you for bringing me back. I want to thank you for being here. This is by far, I think, where it's these, and it's always the largest, most grateful audience I get in the year. I go to conferences, but never like this. I apologize for being late today. I thought I had plenty of time. I didn't anticipate that there was going to be about 20-mile stretch between downtown Milwaukee and for Washington that was going to be so slow, and sometimes I was moving. Barriers were right next to you, and people are cautious. That was a good thing. I didn't see an accident. And then I had a couple of low-income students who applied for big scholarships, so they came to see me as I was getting ready to go, and then, I just wanted to give them a push, thinking that I wasn't going to have trouble getting to Milwaukee. So I apologize for that. So thank you again for coming here. I actually served in the Beloit Plan Commission, and I did something related to the presentation today. Quick Trip is not very present in Beloit. I think they had a gas station, and their competitors have many more. They applied for a permit to open a new one. And I remember that one of my fellow commissioners said, "But are we moving away from gasoline? I mean, are you guys just missing something in the market?" And the fellow from Quick Trip said, "We've done our research." So, I mean, it was a very good application. It was clearly going to sell through, but I think some of my fellow commissioners just wanted to give them something to think about. So on that note, and I think that's a really important one, Quick Trip has definitely done the research, and gasoline is not going to go away. I mean, that's definitely one of the things that I think I will mention today. So with that, let me get right into my presentation. And as I said, I really reiterate my thanks to the sponsors and your patience for watching online. Thank you again for your patience. we test something against empirical evidence. The essays are short. They often try to pack a lot, so we have the data for the analysis, and then I'll add a couple of points of my own. So the person who wrote this piece is Caroline Kisani, professor at NYU, New York University, who specializes on energy politics in particular. And the topic of today's presentation is geopolitics, politics and energy, geopolitics of energy. So she's in a very good position to write about this topic. So let me open by highlighting the goals of my presentation and then the structure of my presentation. So this is what I would like to really get out of this. I'd like to define a few key technical terms such as geopolitics, energy security, and a few others. I also would like to offer an overview of energy policy in different contexts, obviously in the US, and the US is going to be the key case study, but I will also compare the US to other societies. I will also talk about the energy transition that is underway. And this is a very important, I see it coming. Is this not working well?
Keep going, just keep going.
Okay, so I'm going to keep going, and I have to.
Going to put it up just
Okay, so, okay. So this is the Chinese bug. Okay, it's part of the balloon. It's not in South Carolina. Okay, you guys picked it up here. Okay, so back to the goals of the presentation. The third one is to talk about energy transitions, and I really want to call everyone's attention to this one because we only go through an energy transition every 4 generations or so. So probably none of us has gone through one, and we're very fortunate to go through one. So I really make this a key point in my teaching because I want the students to know this is a change that is moving us from where we were for about a century to something else where we'll probably be for a long time. So you actually get to witness this. So don't just blink because you'll miss it. Actually, it's going to take quite a while to get there, but it is very important to be aware that we're going through this and be able to be a part of it. I will also develop a few hypotheses. We seem to be maybe in science, everything seems to tell us a truth, but we always have to anticipate that somebody might prove us wrong. So we seem to be moving in the direction of an energy transition, but maybe we're not. So I really will work on the assumption that we are based on empirical evidence. So I'm not really cooking this up. It's based on the data and the trends that we see, and maybe offer a couple of hypotheses for future developments. And my argument is that the world is transitioning in terms of energy, but different countries are going about it in different ways. And hopefully they will all get there very successfully. I will end up the presentation with a few questions for you to think about. And some questions are more ethical than they are academic, if you will, or scientific. But those are questions that I think are important for all of us to think about as we engage this. And then we'll open it up to discussion. So to do that, to achieve those goals, I divided up my presentation into these 5 parts. We'll open by discussing energy as politics, which is one of the goals that today's writer or scholar wants us to think about. The second section is going to review energy policy in the US and some other key countries around the world that matter for reasons that I'll explain in a minute. Then we'll talk about what an energy transition is and how we're going there. 4, we'll talk about where we are at in that transition, and then I'll offer some conclusions. So with that, let's move on to section number 1, which is energy as politics. One of the arguments that our speaker makes is that energy is often weaponized. It's used as a weapon. If you have it, you can hit people with it. If you don't have it, you are hurting. And we very often know that because energy is what moves our bodies, it's what gives us life, it's what keeps the lights on, it's what got me here today. So for that reason, denying people access to energy means denying them food, denying them mobility, denying them access to wealth, to jobs, to the pleasures of life. And countries are very aware of this, and they do this on a regular basis. Well, actually, I wouldn't say on a regular basis, but they do it fairly regularly when they're dealing with big national issues that they believe other countries are not cooperating with.
Two case studies, for example, of these are the 1973 oil embargo, when political troubles in the Middle East led some of the oil-producing countries to simply not send oil to the West. And that caused tremendous shortages of gasoline, incredible rises in the price of energy, inflation, and the ripple effects of that translated into hyperinflation, high unemployment, an economic crisis, and the quest for solutions for that problem, which actually explain why different countries after that point went in different directions. Normally, we don't often have the best politics, we don't often have the best policies, but crises are very important because they force us to make decisions. And sometimes those decisions actually change the course of history, in this case, energy history, or the way that we do things. Another case study is the COVID-19 pandemic when it broke up. Or the Ukrainian conflict. Both caused tremendous impact on prices, access to energy. Energy is very important, and what we see is that Russia is attacking Ukraine by trying to deny them access to energy, so that the Ukrainian people cannot keep the lights on, so they don't have access to heat, they don't have access to food, to try to push the population to put pressure on the government to surrender and negotiate a peace treaty. So energy is at the core of all of these political issues, and that's why the person writing the essay talks about energy as politics, the politics of energy, and the weaponization of energy. So let me go back to 1973 and this idea that an energy crisis will actually lead to very big decisions. For example, in 1973, many countries around the world, the US included, felt very vulnerable, because something that happened outside had an impact on every aspect of our lives here. And that led to important changes. For example, some countries, Sweden, France, they decided to direct resources, financial, technological, into the production of nuclear energy on the grounds that you produce that domestically, you do not depend on imports from other countries. You gain energy independence. This is the key idea. You still have to have access to whatever you bring to those power plants, but once you have it, you can actually produce the energy, and you have several, you have more control over it. In the case of Denmark, the Danes thought, well, if there's one sort of energy that we actually have plenty of, it's wind. It's flat. We're surrounded by water, it's always windy, so we might as well harvest that. So Denmark actually took the lead in the development of technology for wind energy. That goes back into the 1970s, and today some of the leading companies in terms of technology know-how are in Denmark. Some of them have facilities in the US as well to serve this market. The US actually didn't do a whole lot. What the US did is that they reaffirmed their commitment to energy security, which is a policy that was developed after World War II by President Roosevelt when he went over to Yalta to negotiate the terms of the peace after World War II, and then went over to talk to the king of Saudi Arabia and said to him, it is critical for American development to have access to energy, and we're going to invest very heavily on oil. So we know you have a lot of it, you don't need it, but if you're willing to sell it to us, we're going to pay good money. And that's the reason why the market for oil is actually conducted in dollars, in US dollars, because Saudi Arabia sold it to the US. The US said, is it okay if I pay you in dollars? As a matter of fact, I'm not giving you the choice. If you sell me the oil, I'll give you dollars. But Saudi Arabia, they were very happy with it, because then they collected lots of dollars, which gave them financial stability. So when the crisis happened in 1973, the US strategy is, well, we have all of this infrastructure that is built on the assumption that we will have an endless supply of cheap oil. So what we need to do is go around the world and incentivize the production of further oil. So go to Saudi Arabia, tell them pump more, go to neighboring countries, pump more, and see what we can do domestically as well. So that is the idea. Some changes did happen. The federal government in the 1970s created some funds to do research on alternative energy, what we call renewables today. Not so much because there was concern about environmental impact of fossil fuels, but mostly as an alternative to lessen independence. Some states became very serious about this, California in particular. They invested heavily, but as soon as the price of oil went down in the 80s, those subsidies and those incentives for renewables dried up. Denmark continued to do this. Germany continued to do that. So they became the place where the most innovation was happening when it comes to renewables. So the US looked like it was going to be the leader, but eventually it didn't happen. Another question to ask ourselves, 2022-23, COVID was a major disruption. I'm not going to talk about the health aspects, but economically, in terms of energy, we've seen the price of energy skyrocket, collapse. There was a point that companies would pay you to store their oil. I mean, they're giving it away for free. That is because when the economy shut down, there was no demand for it. So we had more coming into the market that the market could absorb. So then we slowed down production, and then when the economy picked up, then we didn't have enough. There was more need, so the price skyrocketed again. So we have these ups and downs that are the result of these unusual conditions. But it's those unusual conditions that really lead to change. And then comes the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And just like Russia is really trying to hit energy in Ukraine, the European Union and the US are really trying to hit Russia where it hurts. The main export is oil, natural gas in particular. So by not buying their gas, the idea is they're not going to get the revenue that they need to keep buying or building the weapons for war, which means the economy will collapse. They will not be able to wage the war in the long run. But if you're going to do that, then you have to come up with alternatives. So what is the alternative to Russia? And I think that's the question that we see countries around the world asking themselves. So I'll get more into that in a minute. The key here is that all of the countries in general have a policy of energy security. This is the idea. It's a national commitment that we all give ourselves. We expect our governments to help us get there, which means that we have to have reliable access to energy. So what that means is that when I flick the lights on, they come on. That at an affordable price, so that I can actually afford that. It's a matter of national security. And I want to call your attention to a little quote that's buried somewhere in the essay. If you missed it or if you didn't read it, go to it. Megan O'Sullivan, who is an energy expert, is always asking, what's coming next. I mean, she's looking at, what happened, where we're at, but she's always asking what's coming next. And she wrote this book called Windfall, in which she basically claims that we need to think about energy and energy security from a new perspective. And we see countries and societies thinking about this differently, because energy security involves energy without having to confront one's political, diplomatic, security, or military arrangements unduly. What that means is that now we expect the energy to always be there without compromising, without changing anything that we do. So the context is very different, but we don't want to have to make tough decisions. I don't want to stop driving my car. I don't want to lower my thermostat. And I don't want to have troubles with my neighboring countries with anybody else. So can we really have the cake and eat it as well? So the argument that she's making is that that's the pressure that societies are putting on the governments. So I won't like the way it used to be while doing away with the problems that got us here. So that's a very, very tough ask from our elected officials, but that's what we are expecting them to do. Let me move on to section number 2 of my presentation. So how are governments getting us there? Doing what seems to be impossible. Don't change my lifestyle, but change everything. Change the way that you procure energy so that all the bad stuff goes away. So let's look at some of the largest economies in the world and how they're doing this energy security business. So back to 1973. So a couple of things that are very important in the U.S. 1973 did make a few differences in the U.S. I mentioned the U.S. decided to stay the course. That was a little bit of an exaggeration. When you teach students, you exaggerate a little bit to catch their attention to teaching points, and then you clarify what you actually mean. So now I'm clarifying what I really mean about staying the course. We stay in the course. We've access, the point is to have an endless supply of oil, but we realize that our neighbors or those who sell us the oil might actually have a different opinion on it. And at some point, they might actually, turn off the faucet. So then we need to have enough here that we don't need to basically store it somewhere. This is why, all of those depleted wells in the Gulf of Mexico are for, where we can pump a lot. When the price of oil is low, we buy more than we need. We put it in there. And then when our neighbors or Saudi Arabia has a cold and they get upset and they jack up the price, then we say, okay, well, we don't actually need it. We have plenty in Louisiana. So we start pumping a little bit. And we play that game. Saudi Arabia is a very strong ally sometimes, but we know that they're going to try to get us to pay more. So as long as they give us the supply and the increases in prices are not terrible, the U.S. government is okay with that. And they know that they're going to try very hard to jack up the price, but they know the U.S. has this reservoir of oil. So this is a very important thing. Since the 1970s, the U.S. has been able to actually cushion lots of blows thanks to the fact that we have this. If not, we would have seen more of those episodes where the price skyrockets and then there would be consequences. The U.S. actually decided to draw a lot of oil from these reserves when Russia hit Ukraine, and Russia decided to turn off the flow of oil to Western Europe. And the U.S. say, well, when I say that I'm your ally, you can't believe that I am. So I'm going to send you my own supplies, my reserve, because I know you need it, but I want you not to buy Russian. So the U.S. has actually made a commitment to take American reserves of oil to send it to Europe on the condition that Europe, Western Europe, and the U.S. will work together to help Ukraine deal with this crisis. And part of that is denying Russia access to money from the export of their gas. So there's a lot of terminals that have been retrofitted in Western Europe on the Atlantic coast to bring those vessels with American oil from Louisiana to basically keep the Europeans warm in the winter. Okay, another thing that's very important, the U.S. also decided to incentivize the production of fossil fuels, very strong emphasis on fossil fuels. And that actually has been very, very, very positive in terms of access to more oil. In about a decade, the U.S. went from being the top importer of fossil fuels in the world to become the top exporter. So the U.S. became less dependent on international oil because now the U.S. has more, can produce more than we need between Alaska and the fracking that allowed for us to get more oil in places and gas where we couldn't get to it, Pennsylvania, also Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, etc. We have a lot more production that we didn't have before. And thanks to that, more than we can actually produce. We've been sending a lot of that to different countries. Let's talk about Russia. Russia is definitely a very big player in energy. So the importance of Russia comes from the collapse of the Soviet Union. During the Soviet Union, the Soviet government knew they had lots of hydrocarbons under the ground, but they decided not to develop many of those because they were close to the border. They were afraid that there would be an invasion and they would take those. So they thought it's too risky to invest there. So they developed some that were further afield in Siberia. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, one way to pump the post-Soviet economy into business was to actually accelerate those investments. So they spent a lot of money to try to develop new fields. And as a result of that, hydrocarbons has become the main source of revenue for Russia. It's allowed Russia to bounce back. It's allowed Russia to go from the near collapse of its economy in the 1990s to being a fairly decent economy, a decent standard of living, mid-income, the middle class of the world, if you live in some of the big cities of the West, not if you live in the rural areas of Siberia, which is one of the problems with Russia. It's very uneven. Another key component is the European Union decided that Russia was a lot closer than the Middle East and potentially more reliable. So they thought if Russia is developing these hydrocarbons, this is a sign of goodwill. Why don't we stretch out our hand and say, we'll buy from you? It's a way to actually become friends by trading. It would be cheaper. That was the expectation because you can actually bring it through land. And in the long run, it should actually help the Western Europe and Eastern Europe come together and develop good, trusting relationships that would make each other friends in the long run. Well, we'll see how that went. So how it went is that in 2008, Russia invaded parts of Georgia not the U.S. Georgia, the one in the Middle East, Southern Europe. And in 2014, Russia also came up with a plan to annex different parts of Ukraine. What was the response of the European Union? The response in part was critical. You can't do that. This is a violation of international law. You just don't, it's illegal under international law to change a border by force. But we're going to buy more oil from you. The idea is that if we buy more oil, they'll become more dependent on Western Europe and we have more clout. We can tell them, well, now we are the main client that you have. You know, if you don't do the right thing, we're going to stop doing business with you, and then you're going to be very sorry. We call this interdependence. It's a concept that we use in international relations. The idea that, you know, the U.S. has lots of conflicts with Mexico and Canada, but they depend so much on each other for, you know, exports and imports, et cetera, that they always find a way to get through it. You know, that was the idea. So, you know, you build trust, you build good faith with a former enemy by engaging in trade. You become interdependent. You know, the Russians need to sell their oil or gas. The Western Europeans need to buy it. Another one is what we call the spillover effect. Once you develop very strong relations in one industry, there's going to be other industries that follow because there's all of these connections across industries. You know, buying oil and gas from Russia requires access to technology that maybe some of the countries in Europe, the UK, Norway, those that have cutting edge technologies to develop wells under the ocean can actually lend Russia, which in the long run could lower the cost of getting that oil out. So there is this idea that if you buy the oil or the gas from Russia, then they will buy our technology, they'll invite our scientists, we start develop people-to-people relationships, and you know it just keeps getting better and better. Okay. Germany went the farthest, and this is something that is important for us to keep in mind. Germany defied Western Europe and the US really early on in the Cold War, when the US made statements that, you know, we are ready to use nuclear weapons to keep Europe away from the Soviet Union. The Germans were wondering, it's like, so are they saying they're willing to annihilate Germany in order to keep us from going communist? How is that our own security? So Germany started to doubt the US, that whether the US was really willing to lend Germany its nuclear umbrella, and if it did, whether the US would actually press the button to send those nuclear missiles into East Germany. So for the Germans, that was too problematic. They didn't see an advantage one way or the other. So they started to reach out to Russia. We're talking 1950s, 1960s. The idea is we're with the US, we get that, but we need to start relating to the Russians, and we need to make sure we communicate with them. So with this history of 3 decades of growing relations between Germany and Russia that involved exchanging students, sending Russian students to college in Germany and vice versa, exchanging scientists, especially on issues where one of the other was really world-class, but the other one wasn't. So these are good faith exchanges. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Germany said, what if you sell me all the natural gas that I need? So just sell me as much as you can. So Germany went as far as to build a pipeline, and you know they were in the process of finishing up the second pipeline when Russia invaded Ukraine. So as a result of that, Germany is probably the country that hurts the most, and the Germans are still scratching their heads. I mean, the theory was right. Why didn't it work? And now Germany finds itself very dependent on American oil reserves and those that are coming from other countries in Europe. Obviously, Western Europe, some countries in Western Europe are less dependent on Russian oil. The further to the west that you go, the less dependency. And those countries are saying, okay, we're going to ask our people to raise the thermostat in the winter to save some. We're going to send you some to Germany. So we see a concerted effort by the Allies to try to help those that are hurting the most. And very few societies are hurting more than Germany, and also the Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, that got most of their natural gas, if not all, some of them all from Russia. And Russia really is playing with fire because 80% of their foreign revenue comes from natural resources, most of it from hydrocarbons. So the result of that is that countries in Western Europe find themselves in different places. So here's some comparison. So if you're looking at 1922, last year, we see that some countries have become very, very, very independent of natural gas because they have developed renewable energy. And you see Denmark at the top there. So more than half of the energy needs of Denmark are provided by their wind. We see that Germany actually does very well there. What's ironic about Germany is Germany went with solar. So the Danes went with wind, Germany went with solar on the ground, and there's some rationale to this. For the Danes, we're a peninsula surrounded by water, it's always windy, wind makes the most sense. For the Germans is we want to produce energy as close as the places where they're needed. So the wind blows more in some places than others. If you put the windmills there, then you need to build the grid. And the grid that we have in Germany was built for oil and natural gas and for coal. So the power plants are not exactly where the wind blows, which means you have to build it from scratch. So in order not to do that, if we go with solar, we basically give incentives to mount panels on people's homes. And that means that people are actually harvesting their own energy. So that was the rationale from Germany, to try to minimize the cost of developing a new grid. And then, we have a few other countries that just included the really big countries in Europe. So we see Romania, Spain, Italy, Poland, France, they all are moving in the direction of renewables. For France, I do want to call your attention to the fact that 14% is renewables, but more than half is nuclear for France, which means that France's reliance on gas is a lot smaller than that number might suggest because they invested in nuclear. So let's talk about the US now. So the US, back to energy security, the US Department of Defense, and this is very important, energy security is a matter of national defense. So it's not just the Department of Energy, but it's the Department of Defense. For the Department of Defense, securing American access to reliable, affordable, and sustainable energy is the core of its mission. The US Department of Defense is the biggest investor in renewable energy in the country. You need to have a steady, cheap, reliable, independent, easily mobile supply of energy to move troops around. The cheaper it is to power the big tanks, the planes, the more independent they can be, the longer the range. If you can actually master a way to have those fighting machines power themselves as they fly or as they move around, then you have an advantage over your opponent. So the development of renewables in this country owes the most, or at least as much, to the Department of Defense than any other. So that is very important. It's a matter of national defense to have access to the latest technologies to move into renewables. It's a military aspiration up there. There is a number of potential problems, some domestic, some international. One of the problems that we have is that in terms of energy, we build our energy technology for a world that is changing. Think about the deep freeze in Texas. How many people died just last week? Think about how many people died during the previous deep freeze, because that was not supposed to happen in Texas. Utilities build their grid for the kind of weather, but not for the extremes that they're getting right now. So that has created a lot of problems. Texas, unlike other states, states normally have an agreement with neighbors that if for some reason weather events or some technological calamity keeps Wisconsin from having access to the supply of energy that we need, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois will come to the rescue. And that requires that the federal government coordinates interstate transportation. Texas does not want to be bound by federal rules. So they didn't sign this agreement with any state, which means that when the supply disappeared, they were not connected. They had a way to get their energy out, but they didn't have a way to turn it around and get the energy back in, which means that they were on their own. And for the last 2 years, this is a big conversation that is going on in Texas. I mean, the neighboring states are really willing to sign up an agreement with Texas because they know Texas has a lot of energy. So if they have a problem, Texas is there to save them. But Texas is still reluctant to actually comply with some of these federal regulations. So that is a problem. Another one is that the global conditions is climate change. We have an infrastructure that was built for the weather that was predictable, and what was considered extreme weather is not that extreme anymore, if you look at the pattern. So that means that every time we upgrade energy infrastructure, we have to actually invest more money to account for these weather events. One of the reasons why the energy infrastructure froze in Texas is because they were expecting that cold weather to happen once every century. I can't remember the data. So they said, does it make sense to invest so much money in something that is probably not going to happen until we die? That's money that we have to pass on to taxpayers, except that it's happened twice in 2 years now. So that is a big question for societies to ask themselves. I mean, so, what's the new normal and how do you account for that? The second point that we talk about is when it comes to renewables, the US is very behind. If you look at the numbers that I just showed you, the US is very behind some of the leading countries in Europe, but we'll see that it's really behind other countries in Latin America and China in particular. So the US is a major energy powerhouse, but when it comes to renewables, other than the Department of Defense and a few others, people are not really pushing in this direction. So the good news from the US perspective is that a quarter of all investments going into energy in the last couple of years have gone into renewables. Precisely for the reasons that we mentioned. You don't have, the supply is closer to what the demand is. You reduce dependence on the outside, and you minimize many of these other problems that otherwise you would have. Let's look at China, because China has become a major player. So China has been increasing the amount of fossil fuels they buy. And one of the reasons why the price of oil and hydrocarbons has gone up so much is because China has been buying more and more and more. And even though there is more production in the Middle East, but also in the US, China's demand is really high. So when a number of conditions happen, China's increasing demand, bad problem with weather in Texas, et cetera, we see the price skyrocket. So China is looking for alternatives. China is trying a number of things. They're trying to go into fracking, like it worked in the US. The Chinese are not shy to try things that work elsewhere. They're looking for new sources of energy around the world. They're constantly looking into buying. Another one is that they're also innovating. China is the largest investor in renewables in the world. So no country is investing more. And China is new to this. The US took the lead in the 70s, Denmark, Germany, Europe, but China has really stormed past them from behind in the last 10 years. There was a time in the 90s and 2000s when China was stealing all this technology, but now they're already past in terms of technology in some industries, and they're really leading the world and bringing down prices because they're pumping so much money into research that in a way we benefit from that. Because if we were to buy this Chinese technology, the price is already lower. The challenge that creates is because our producers are not competitive, will drive them out of business. So, I mean, how do you really deal with that? Unless we are willing to subsidize domestic production, the Chinese will basically eventually corner the market. And this is a very important thing. In many countries, they don't care who's making the technology. As long as solar, renewable, et cetera, is available, they're willing to buy from the cheapest source. So China has found lots of markets in Latin America, Africa, Europe, and that also further has decreased production costs because they're produced in the developing scale, not just for the Chinese market, but for 2/3 of the world as well. So let's talk about geopolitics. This is another key definition that is mentioned in the reading. And I think now we're in a good position now that we've seen the evidence to think about what this means. So geopolitics is a compound word that refers to the interplay of politics and geography. To what extent geography shapes politics, and to what extent politics can change geographic conditions in a particular setting. That's what we're talking about. Energy geopolitics, we add energy to the geopolitics, is how the geography of energy influences the politics and how the politics influences energy markets around the world. So lots of different parts coming together. So in essence, geography matters a lot. Whether you have access to oil or not will determine whether you're a buyer or a seller, and that will determine the political game that you play. If you're a seller, you want high prices. If you're a buyer, you want low prices. So that's what we're talking about. And the global framework means that the big buyers, the big producers have a lot of power over the market. And the ones we've mentioned so far, Russia, China, the European Union as a whole, and the US. So those four probably will determine the future of energy, just like the US and Saudi Arabia alone really determining the energy world that we've lived in since the 1940s until today, which is oil and gas all the way. That's what we're going to do. So now these guys are really pulling in different direction. Russia is saying, yes, keep actually burning gas and oil. China is saying, for as long as we have to, but we're trying not to have to for too long, because then we have to rely on these guys. We don't have a lot of oil in China. It doesn't make any sense to power the world on oil. So this is not what we want. We'll try to get as much as we can, but we need to move away from that. And we're going to go with renewables. China is sunny. China's coasts are windy. Tibet is very windy. So we're going to go with that. And the European Union is thinking, okay, we decided to go with oil and gas to help Russia, but now that didn't turn out to be a good idea. So the European Union is really at a really important moment where they have to make very tough decisions in a very short time. So who will set the rules is critical, because the rules will determine what technology we all buy in the future. Remember when we got video? Well, VHS, Beta, 2000, I can't even remember that. I was a little boy when that came out. I could never understand. I was asking my parents, so what happens if you get one of these? Can you get that? And my parents were scratching their head, and I'm not sure. Same thing. You know, if you really push your technology through, then you basically corner the market, and then everybody has to buy your technology. And that's what China's trying to do. They're trying to make it as effective and efficient and cheap as possible, so the world will rely on it. Supply. So the idea is you buy my technology, but you harvest your own wind. So it's already at home. All you need to do is put the blades there or the solar panels, which I'm very willing to provide, and then you're independent, except that you're not, because you depend on Chinese technology. The second one is finance, and China's willing to give you credit. You can't afford it, no big deal. This pays for itself. I mean, I'll give you a plan. In the next 15, 20 years, it's going to pay for itself. Shut down those power plants. Look at the price of energy. If you actually look at the price of oil today, projected into the future, this is going to pay for itself in 5 years. So that's exactly what the Chinese are doing around the world. They send armies of economists to countries, and they say, you know, why are you taking so long? And by the way, while you buy my infrastructure, I can also sell you all kinds of things. I can sell you cheap stuff that probably will last you a couple of days, and then I'll send you much more. So you can go to the dollar store, you'll have it there. And by the way, I like your soybeans. My people like soy very much. You pay with the soy. Talk to your farmers, tell them that, you know, we'll buy their stuff for the next 20 years. That's good insurance, because you don't know what the summer is going to be like. But if I guarantee that they'll get X amount of money for 2 decades, what farmer is going to say this is not a good deal? And I'm willing to let them put the number on the check. So this is how China is developing the network around the world. And then international law. And by the way, should your farmers not pay, we're going to find a court of arbitration in case I need to sue someone, because they can say, go get me in Wisconsin. No. Go meet me in The Hague, or go meet me somewhere. So they have an army of very smart people that sell these packages around the world. It's a win-win-win by China. So who sets the rules is incredibly important. So will the price of soy in Wisconsin be determined by these deals that are being cooked up in Beijing? We're moving in that direction. This is the way farmers work in Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, which are the top exporters of soy, for example, in the world. And they're happy with that, because the production is not always the same every year, but the Chinese are willing to give you a little more for a bad year so that they actually secure a contract over the long run. Okay, so this is all a balancing act, as you can expect. So there's so many moving parts, but in the end of the day, something will stick, and that will create some form of normalcy that will shape our lives, our businesses for the next 50 years, perhaps, if not longer. So this is what I keep telling my students that we're actually witnessing. So this is what's going on. This is what's being negotiated. So when President Biden goes around and says, we have to bring the microchips here, we have to bring the solar panels here, that's exactly what he's talking about. He knows the US is coming from behind. It's actually falling further behind, and he's trying to find a way to catch up and pass China and try to bring the Europeans with the US. The big debate in the news these days is who qualifies, what cars, EVs qualify for subsidies. Those made in the US, the Europeans will say, we're making those cars as well. So if you do not allow our cars to qualify for American subsidies, then we're gonna have to do the same with you, and who's gonna win? The Chinese. So you can't beat the Chinese alone, so you're gonna have to choose. So if you try to take them on alone, they're already ahead of you, and they're ahead of me too. I was ahead of them. They stole my technology, and now they run with it. So I need you to work with me. And that's exactly what the Europeans and the Americans are negotiating. If you read the news these days, that's exactly what we see. It's absolutely fascinating. A little thing somewhere can really change everything. And the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is not a little thing. It's a huge thing, especially for the hundreds of thousands of people who have already died. I mean, maybe even 500,000 of people have already died, depending on what reports you actually trust. We're really talking about half the population of Milwaukee in just 1 year. This is absolutely tragic. And China and India are loving it. They're probably not loving that people are dying, but because the Western Europeans are fighting the war, in part by denying Russia access to oil revenue, that means Russia has a lot of oil that they don't know what to do with. So China and India are saying, we'll buy it, at a discount, we'll buy it. So now the question is, how do we get it there? So you also probably read the news, how the Americans are calling these vessels in the middle of the Indian Ocean, how they turn around, or else we'll never let you get back to the US. So that's the oil and the natural gas that India and China are buying, that the US is trying to get China and India not to buy. They're trying to get those vessels that were coming to the US or going to Western Europe to turn around as they were going to India to come back to the US. So it's absolutely fascinating that the war is being fought out, at that point. And, the problem is many of these vessels are registered in Liberia or in Panama. Their crews are from all kinds of countries. They are hired by a company that is in Europe or India, but they do business with the US, so that's what the US is using in Western Europe. If you deliver that to India, you are never coming back to Western Europe, to the EU or the US. So China is definitely telling them, well, why would you? We'll give you a 20-year deal. You'll bring all of this oil and gas from Russia. Why would you want to go to the US if they're so mean to you? You come, you sign this paper, we'll take care of it. You won on a cash advance, here's 5 years worth of oil. So come over, and we've got smart people, lawyers, insurance agents, the kinds of people that you don't want to see, but you don't want to not have them. Okay. So China is really playing all of these cards. They really know energy geopolitics, and they're really playing a game like the world is a chessboard, and they're playing everywhere. So let's see what else we have here. We get into the point that that this question is actually a very interesting one to ask ourselves in the US. We talk about subsidizing energy. I mean, if there's one industry that has been subsidized in many ways, is energy in this country, precisely because of energy security. The idea is that, well, let's stop subsidizing energy. Well, yes, it's good to say that, but what energy source is not subsidized? So one of the arguments that Janet Yellen, the US Secretary of the Treasury, is putting on the table is that, well, we need to go further than subsidizing energy. Looking at what China and Russia are doing, and India and other countries that are taking advantage of the suffering in Ukraine, we might actually have reached the point that you just can't do business only with your friends. The US needs to think about this. So if the Europeans are willing to work with us and develop our technology, maybe that's what we need to do so that we don't buy the Chinese. So friendshoring is the term that we're talking about right now. The market is not going to get us to be the leaders. The market is failing us here because somebody is already in the lead. So we need to use politics to manipulate the market so that the market will deliver what we actually want. So this is not the most efficient solution for the world. The most efficient, we're all better off if we buy the cheapest technology, which is what China has. But the argument is, can you trust that the Chinese one day will say, now that you guys don't have your own producers, you're out of luck. are going to jack up the price if you want it. Think about TikTok as well. It's a very famous app. My students love it, apparently. I don't know what it is, but I'm like, why is it that China, wants it so bad? And I don't think they understand that. But, you become very dependent on China, and that's the argument. It might be time to tame the markets in a way that serve our projects as a community, as a society. We can't have faith that the market will always deliver what we want as a society. And maybe the U.S. needs to move in that direction. So the question is really up there for Americans to actually decide. Politicians get elected to push the agendas that we give them. So she's basically asking a question. We're all for letting the markets work, but in this case, if we do, where is that going to get us? So another argument that she develops is that if we actually set limits to the importation of Chinese renewable technology, we can bring production to the US. So that means more jobs that are going to come home, more manufacturing jobs, which in places like Wisconsin, which has one of the highest shares of manufacturing jobs in the country, is probably good news. It also lowers dependence on Russia and imports from other countries. So she's basically suggesting, like the defense, that it is time to transition to renewables, which moves us to section number 3. So what is an energy transition? I'm going to go a little bit faster now because I have a lot of graphs. I will just call your attention to what the graphs are supposed to teach us. So let me open by defining what an energy transition is. Peter O'Connor, a very prominent scholar of energy, wrote this paper on energy transition, and he defines it as a change in the pattern of energy use in our society. It's really actually more simple than we think. A change in the pattern of use. But there is 4 kinds of things to take into consideration. One of them is the resource. Are we getting our energy from the sun, from the wind, from gas? Second one, the carrier. What carries the energy? Is it gasoline? Is it electricity? So that's a decision that we made as a society over 100 years ago. It wasn't always like this. The federal government made that decision for us. So the time has come to make another tough decision right now. Another one is the converter. I mean, how do we convert that energy into something we use? By using LEDs? By using a kerosene lamp? I mean, how do we actually use that? That's another decision. Also, we move from whales to where we are today. Those are energy transitions. And another one is for what service? Do we use energy for transportation? Do we use it for lighting? Do we use it for food? What do we use it for? Again, those are decisions that we have to make as a society. So those 4 dimensions require a lot of thinking, because any change along any of those 4 involves an energy transition. And here is an example. For example, as a resource. So for the last 175 years, what we see here is energy sources coming up and down. This is the resource, wood. When your ancestors came to this country from Europe, they were probably burning the woods. And then for one reason or another, probably because they ran out of woods to burn, they decided to move into coal. So then coal became the second source of energy. But then oil and gas were starting to become important. And as a result of that, at some point after World War I, coal started to decline. So coal has been in the decline for about 100 years right now. We see that in the last few years it's still here. But in general, what we see is the first energy transition went from wood to coal, then from coal to hydrocarbons. So those are the 3 easy ones. Converters, for example, here we have anything from, we have candles up there, whale oil, gas, kerosene, electricity. It seems like electricity is the one that we seem to enjoy the most right now. So we see that one there. Maybe because we ran out of whales. So that often is the case. I'm being funny, but very often one of the transitions happens because it just dries up. Scotland is moving away from gas because they just pumped everything that was pumpable. So now they're looking for alternatives. So what drives an energy transition? So one of them is the availability of resources. If you're burning whales, once you don't have whales to burn, you have to move away from it. If you burn the wood from the forest, but then you run out of forest, then you have to move away from it. So this is one of the reasons why we have an energy transition. In this case today, we're not running out of gas. We're not running out of oil. We've got plenty. We're not running out of coal. So that is not what's driving the energy transition. The second one is technology. Very often, a source of energy remains, but we find that there is other cheaper ones that thanks for technological developments, we can actually access. There was a point that part of the story is it was cheaper to actually get coal from a mine than to actually find trees to harvest and take to Americans' homes. So it was also a matter of technological innovation that delivered cost advantages. It made technology was available that allowed us to move into new sources at a very affordable price. Another one is performance. If we had lots of whales to go around, maybe a lamp powered by whales is probably not going to be as effective as this. So even if we had it at an affordable price, if you let people choose, they'll probably go with the one that makes them more comfortable, the ones that, doesn't really make them go blind. And another one that's important is policy decisions. Very often, because of war, because of ideology, because of many political reasons, sometimes governments decide to go one direction or the other. At around 1900, about a third of Americans had home energy provided by wind. If you remember the movies in the 19th century, there's always a mill moving around. And Congress made the decision to mandate that every American home be connected to a power plant. Because the concern by the federal government is this is going to put people in the rural areas at a disadvantage, and it's unfair. Just because you live on a farm, you shouldn't be denied access to a reliable supply of energy that would allow you to power the lights so your kids can study, whatever tools you need, etc. So there was a law that passed that every American home has to be connected to a power plant. And at the time, many of them were coal, and then with time, most of them were fossil fuels. So the transition to fossil fuels, which are dirtier than wind, was done not because the federal government wanted to pollute our air, just because they wanted to give Americans a fair chance, especially those in the rural areas. It was a rural versus urban divide. It was a policy decision that had tremendous implications. It probably gave people in rural areas access to technology and power they normally wouldn't have had the federal government not mandated the utilities to deliver. Okay, you got Milwaukee, but you also have to provide electricity to all of these little towns, which means that the people in Milwaukee probably pay more to subsidize those in the rural areas because it's very expensive to take energy as the population density decreases, per head. Another one is, as I mentioned, the availability of heating fuels. Here we see that since the oil crisis, mid-20th century, natural gas has been a very predominant source of energy. And in the Midwest in particular, it's natural gas. If you go to the South, for example, they heat their homes or they cool their homes with electricity. We like to use natural gas in the winter. We normally go with electricity in the summer. So in New England, in the Midwest, natural gas is the way to go, again, for historical reasons, connection to the pipelines, reliability, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing that's really important for us to think about is how efficient are we with our energy? I mean, do we make the most out of it? So what we see here in this graph is the US, with the comparable cases, is the worst. We're very wasteful. Think how many, we basically need twice as much energy as the United Kingdom to power ourselves. We need about, 10 times more than the Chinese to power ourselves. So what that means is that we have an energy system that is incredibly inefficient, perhaps. But we are very good at becoming more efficient by squeezing more wealth out of every unit of energy. So if you look at the trend here, the trend going down is actually a positive one. It means that we're getting less wasteful. We're still more wasteful than our competitors, but we're less wasteful than we were. And look at Russia. Russia is definitely wasting a lot. And if you look at per capita use, China does very well. If you look at a unit of output, China doesn't, which means that here in the US, we can generate more wealth per unit of energy than China does. And they're aware of that. That's what really pushing in a different direction. Okay, so I'm going to go through these very quickly because I really want you to see the trends. Between 1973, the oil crisis, and today, what we see is that we use less oil. That's really the main takeaway, that we use a lot less oil. And instead, we use more natural gas, still a fossil fuel. Another thing that happened in the last few years, we see that the world uses way more energy than we did before. We actually use 3 times what we had before. So, and we see that a lot of that is coming from coal and oil and natural gas, all of them fossil fuels. We also see that Europe, as we saw in the graph, is very efficient. The US is becoming more efficient. Our neighbors in the Americas are very efficient as well. So North, South, Central America, we tend to be very efficient. But look at Asia. The Asians are the ones that are really, really taking up a lot of energy. In part, not so much because it's a matter of efficiency, but also because, you know, they're growing a lot. I mean, the populations are growing and they're developing. If we only look at OECD countries, it means the wealthiest countries of the world, here's that very interesting picture. For the last 20 years, we're actually using less energy. So energy use is decreasing, even though our populations are not. And what we see here is coal in particular is decreasing faster. We see that natural gas is making up for the difference, and then we see the blip at the very top, which is the renewables. As an overall share, renewables are still very small, but we did see that the big loser is coal. How does the US compare to other countries? The US is without a doubt a powerhouse, an energy powerhouse. That's a very important takeaway. The key here is the details. So in terms of oil, the US is the main producer. About 1/5 of the oil in the world comes from the US. Look at Russia. As I mentioned, we talk about Saudi Arabia. We don't need Saudi Arabia anymore up to a point, but our allies do. So it's good to keep them in business. So I'm happy to go to these later, but really the takeaway is look at the US. Gas, same thing. The US produces 1/4 of the world's gas. And look who comes next. Russia, a beloved friend of Iran. And China, look how far behind they are. Coal. China, India, very interesting. And that's because it is the most readily available source of energy for their development. They know that it has lots of problems, but it's the one they have. And they're really digging as much as they can to power their cities, and that's why the air in Indian and Chinese cities is really polluted. The US is down there. Ironically, the US does worst in terms of coal. Nuclear, the US also tops the charts. About 1/3 of nuclear energy is produced in the US, and you guys are more familiar with that because we have a power plant nearby, one that's waiting for things to happen. We see France there is one of the top producers. We see China. China has been building reactors like crazy. Now that they realize that coal is bad, they're really moving into renewables and nuclear. Russia, not so much. Russia doesn't feel they need to build nuclear. They know nuclear has problems. And they have plenty of oil and natural gas, so they don't feel the need for this. Hydro, China as well. If you can dam a river, do it. And the biggest dam in the world is in China. We actually had an environmental activist at Beloit College a few years ago. Her dad was a member of the Communist Party, and she was threatened because she only was pretty much alive because of her dad, but she would go to the government and say, you can't do this, you can't put these dams here because there is all kinds of consequences. And she said, China is a damned country. I remember that was the title of a presentation. So we see Brazil there, and that's important. We're gonna get to Brazil in a minute. So wind. So we can see that wind is the fastest grower. But it starts from so little. So you can see that wind is really making a big deal. And look at China alone, how big they are on wind. So China, definitely the top producer of wind energy in the world. I mentioned that China is the leader, and here's the evidence to prove it. About 1/4 to 1/3 of the world's wind energy is produced in China. But the US is doing really well. even though as a share of national energy is low, because we produce so much of it, especially in a few states, the US still producing about a fifth of the world's. But I do want to call your attention to the European Union. If you do the math, and if you add Germany, UK, Spain, France, and all of the other countries, the EU as a whole passes the US. And is really trying to, catch up with China. So that is a little bit deceiving because we break up the EU countries, but the EU countries basically have no local borders, no domestic borders. They trade with one another. They all develop wind and solar, and they cooperate. So we should see that they're really, really shooting up. Okay, and this is solar as well. I also call your attention to China. If you see that most of the new developments in terms of solar are also coming out of China. So these are the top producers of solar energy in the world. We can see that China is the leader, about a third as well. We see the US there in solar is not doing as well. The US has gone with wind. I think solar is really picking up. But we can see, again, call your attention to the European Union. If we look at the European countries and we add them up, they're probably 2 as a whole in the world. And it does help to think about the EU as a single actor in that sense. So where are we at today? So one of the takeaways in the article that we read, and I really wanted to explore a little more, is that energy security requires a diversification of our energy sources. The author is not arguing for shutting down all of our gas-powered power plants. She's not calling for shutting down nuclear power plants, but she's really calling for a transition towards renewables, but one that is orderly, gradual, and cheap. And to do that, she suggests that we should listen to Janet Yellen and the Department of Defense. We really need to keep putting our money in that direction. And I will call your attention to the fact that many countries are really far ahead, and not necessarily China. Look at these guys. So Scandinavia and Latin America are far ahead of everybody else. So look at Iceland. Almost all of its energy is renewable. Costa Rica, so one reason to go on vacation there. Norway. The problem with Norway is that Norway produces a lot of gas. They just don't burn it. They sell it to other countries and they use that revenue to buy windmills and renewables. Uruguay, Scotland. I mentioned Scotland. Scotland knows that gas is over pretty much. They're drying. They're getting their resources are drying up. So they're investing in wind farms. I mean, the government of Scotland has really been pushing for this. They want to be they want to remain the powerhouse of the UK, but not with that. I call your attention to Brazil. All of these countries are great, but they're totally meaningless, because they're very small. Brazil, however, we're talking about a country comparable to the US in size. So the US only has an 11% share of renewables. Look at the US to the right at the bottom. Still, that's better than Wisconsin, by the way. But Brazil, a country of several hundred million people, generates almost 4/5 of its energy needs from renewables. So that is remarkable, because one of the arguments is, well, this country is small, it's very easy to power small countries. Well, it's not easy to power Brazil. And yet, they're doing it. And look at China, a quarter. Look at Germany, about half. Look at California, Texas. California, Texas are really, in a way, the states that really matter. They're as big as some states in the world, and if they go with renewables, they really make a big difference, because they have a market. If they go with renewables, they bring prices down because they incentivize production, and they retire a lot of other polluting sources of energy. India also has realized that the polluted cities are really getting the people sick. That's costing them in terms of days that they cannot go to work, days when the people cannot move around, either because they get sick or because they have to shut down transportation. So there is economic cost to pollution. So they're really investing very heavily to retire their coal as soon as they can. The EU as a whole is not doing that great, in part because many countries rely very heavily on fossil fuels and nuclear as well. So, but look at Wisconsin, and now the one who's really fortunate is Saudi Arabia, because they can only do better. Look at that, 0.2%. Okay, so if you have to engage in energy policy, Saudi Arabia is the place where you want to make a difference. You put a couple of solar panels, you're already doing better. Okay, so a couple of things to keep in mind. So the transition to renewables is underway. That's the transition that we are going through, and I really want to call your attention to this. You might like it or not. I know the issue has been very politicized, but industry is telling us we need to go there. Defense is telling us we have to go there. Our competitors are telling us, keep thinking about it, we're getting there. So the question is, what to do about this? What are we going to do? And the idea is that countries, especially the world leaders, except for Russia, Saudi Arabia, they're really moving in that direction. They're going in the direction of renewables. However, the changes by the Russian invasion of Ukraine have actually produced some interesting results. To make up for the loss of Russian energy, Germany has actually brought back some of the coal power plants into commission, which means that we're going back to an energy that Germany had already phased out. They had already shut down their coal mines, so they have to bring coal from the US and from other countries to power those plants. Japan, after the nuclear incident in Fukushima, Japan was very reliant on nuclear because they don't have any sources of energy, oil and gas. So when the tsunami destroyed Fukushima, they had to shut down all power plants to actually check them for safety. And that meant that they needed to power themselves with fossil fuels. So in that sense, they went backwards. They got to use dirtier sources. But at the same time, it's like taking a step back to take two forward. They're really investing very heavily in renewables so that they retire those sources as soon as possible and they can move past oil and gas in Germany and nuclear in Japan. So, and India, as I mentioned, India is invested in coal, is taking advantage of the fact that Russian gas is cleaner than coal, so they're really buying cheap to clean up their air, but they're really investing very heavily in renewables as well, because they really need to clean up their air. People get elected or lose office on this, and the Chinese people, the government knows that when you can't breathe the air in your city, people start taking to the streets, and then you lose control. And we saw what happened with the protests in China over COVID. Something like this happened a few years ago over pollution in the city. Okay. So a couple of things here. Let's bring it home. This is really important. One of the arguments by defense and the speaker today is that in addition to lessening dependence on international disruptions, it does help us clean up our air. So how clean is our air? So I just decided to look into the data. So I'm going to pull out of these. And actually, I want to call your attention to the EPA before I do that. Back to the slide. So according to the EPA, clean air that is healthy is that registers fewer than, I don't want to get too technical here, so certain amount of particulate matter, which are very, very, very fine particles that result from the burning of fossil fuels. So the EPA has recommended, based on factual information that we get on the rise of respiratory diseases, has recommended to actually improve the standards. And the standard right now is that anything above 9 milligrams per cubic meter is considered unhealthy. So call your attention to 9 to 10. As opposed to 12 today. So here's where we are. I didn't go online, but I did download the latest data before I left my house at 3. So remember, 10 is healthy. This is where you guys in Manitowoc are. The average for the last 3 days is 71. So you're breathing very unhealthy air. So either you're driving around too much or you have a power plant here that is putting a lot of stuff into the air that we breathe. So there's a warning on it. So if you go into, I recommend that you go to the website and check out for this. You shouldn't be running outside, especially if you have any condition. So it is, the air is, according to this, very polluted. This is a cheap sensor, by the way. So they tend to overreact to pollution. So they tend to just shoot up when they pick up something. The EPA will calculate the average. What you really want is a long trend. But if you just look at the last 3 days, the average, again, is 10. And we're really talking 71. So that's 7 times worse than it could be. But Beloit does not like to be outdone by Manitowoc, so look at our air. It's just as bad as yours. No, sorry, this is yours. This is ours. So it's actually worse by a little. So actually, 72-71, we win. Okay. So it's interesting to see the patterns as well. Normally, when it's windy, the wind picks up. You know, for us in Beloit, it cleans up the air. When you have these really beautiful sunny days, all of the pollution from the city and our power plant just sits on top of us. And at night, when the sun goes to sleep, the cold air just brings it down. So you can look at the temperature and correlate it with pollution. You see that at night, the pollution just skyrockets. And then when the sun comes out, it goes down. So in your case, I suspect the reason for the pollution here is because the wind is coming out of the east, the plant is to the west, the pollution cannot go into the lake. You very kindly send it to Michigan, but Michigan doesn't want it. So I think that's what explains it. So the wind probably turned to the east about 2 days ago, and that's what's keeping it here. So as soon as the wind just moves in a different direction, your air will be cleaner, but some of your neighbors will not. So that's the beauty of this. Okay. So I do want to call your attention to that because you really have, Beloit, by the way, Rock County in general has one of the highest rates of respiratory problems in the state of Wisconsin, according to the Wisconsin Department of Health. So the quality of our air would actually explain that. Considering that yours is not a lot cleaner than ours, it is a little bit. I would suspect that, you know, your lungs are just as good as ours, or bad. Okay. And to bring it to a close, so there's a dirty side to clean energy that I think we all need to think about as well. So if we're going to be moving in the direction of renewables, we need new materials to actually make renewables. We need new rare earths for making, the EVs, to the packs that will, store the energy. And a lot of that is coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is a country that went through a civil war recently that cost the lives of 5 million people. Imagine 5 million people in a few years. It's like the entire state of Wisconsin gets butchered in a war, and nobody cares. So, I mean, it's just really tragic. And the aftermath of that is lots of armed guerrilla groups. The state does not have control over the population. The neighboring states is trying to claw their way into some of the mining resources. And what you get is that, in the end, some companies will hire guerrillas that will create a slave-like operation in which slave workers are mining the soil in very bad conditions, child labor as well, who could be soldiers, but they're going to be now by getting coltan and all of these minerals. Women will be forced in as sex workers to keep the workers going. And while we do all that, we're going to destroy the habitat of some of the endangered animals, and we're going to be destroying the waterways and many other things. And we do have a lot of graphic detail of that. You know, if you look at the top two pictures, these are child labor who get taken from their families. Some of them are orphans, and they go into these places, and then you can see teenagers going down into the mines in very unsanitary conditions, very dangerous conditions. Nobody tracks down to the source, so China comes and says, I'm not going to ask you questions, here's the money, just get it to us, we'll get it to the port, ship it to China. Companies in the US are doing exactly the same thing. They go to the mediators, I don't want to see it, don't tell me, just give it to me. So how much is it? The Chinese are giving us X. This is why. So we are really, really, really developing EVs on the blood of others. Women are being forced into prostitution, children are denied the opportunity to go to school, and young men are basically locked up in these places and forced into the ground to work with their bare hands, so we have our EVs. So that's a huge ethical question that we have to deal with. And of course, the companies that make the cars, Tesla doesn't want you to know any of this because this can raise questions. You need to certify the origins of these, and China does not need any certification. So it's a race. We want to beat the Chinese, so don't ask too many questions. Another place is lithium. So one of the places that where we're going to be getting lithium from is the largest salt flat in the world, the Salar de Uyuni, which is a place like no other in the world, which is going to look like the one on the right, which is the Atacama Desert in in Chile. This is the driest place on Earth. Lithium is produced by the water that melts from the mountains in the Andes, filters through, and picking up a number of chemicals, it becomes what it does. This is a very amateurish definition. The point is that this is the driest place on Earth. So we're collecting the lithium that took thousands of years to produce. We're removing it, at tons and tons per day. And that's completely changing the ecosystem and leaving behind a wasteland like that. Again, if we want EVs, this is the way that we're doing it. And that also raises an ethical question. This is also lots of Native Americans that live out there. So in conclusion, this beautiful, brave new world we're living in is making us think about a number of things. The energy transition to clean energy is very dirty, and it's underway. So we need to clean it up. That would be my ethical takeaway. How do we do it? Well, if I knew. So, but we definitely have to think about these questions, because it is, when we plug in our car, we know that some women are being engaged in prostitution so that we can plug it in. We know that some boys are dying in those places so that we can plug it in. So they're paying with their lives to do this. So the takeaway is that we really want to get to a world where most of our energy is renewables. But because we don't have the storage capacity to store the energy from the wind when it blows, from the sun when it shines, we need to have a backup. So we need to have other alternatives. And those alternatives could be gas, could be oil, could be nuclear, could be could be biomass, could be waste. But this is a decision that we have to make as a society. Putting this information out there is intelligence. Intelligence is giving people data to then make informed decisions. So this is the direction we're going, and these are the decisions that we have to make. The smartest decision is to have a diverse mix, one that relies mostly on clean energy that has been produced with materials that have been humanely harvested, but then have a backup. And that backup could be storage facilities, or it could be one power plant that produces a little bit of pollution here and there, definitely not what we have in Manitowoc or Beloit, and then make up for it somewhere else. And I will end with a few questions to think about, in addition to the one that I just gave you, which with the author of the essay didn't. To me, this is a very important ethical question. We're transitioning on the backs of others. So she thinks we need to wonder if we want a world where we bring back nuclear. I mean, you guys made the decision around here to move away from nuclear. She's thinking maybe we need to bring it back. If not, what else? Again, the wind and the sun probably will not give us all our needs. How are we going to meet the difference? Do we really want to refrain from Russian oil? Can we ease up a little so we bring prices down? But that means the Russians will get a war advantage. That's a tough question as well. How can the US persuade other countries, or should, to collaborate with them so they can actually catch up with China, which seems to be taking the lead in terms of renewables? What should we expect from China? Is China going to play a fair game once they corner the market? If they do, what are they going to do? How do we engage with them? Or maybe should the US just team up with China? We know you're in the lead. We're going to let you sell your stuff in the US, but you have to give us a piece of the pie. So it's a tough question as well. And then again, think about the negative impact or the dirty side of clean. And with that, I'll bring it to an end. Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate your kindness that you waited for me, even though I was a little late. And I really invite comments, thoughts, questions, concerns, conundrums, and many others. So thank you very much. Thank you to those in the room. And thank you to those at home.
I do hate to be the bearer of bad news, but because we got a late start, we don't have any time for a discussion this evening, because we genuinely do all have to be out at the library by 8 o'clock.
Okay.
However, Professor Toral will be back in about 5 weeks, I believe, lecturing on economic warfare. So start thinking of your questions now. Think of a better route than through Milwaukee. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Everyone, next week, remember our lecture is going to be exclusively online. Elise Cohen will be talking about climate migration. Starts at 6 o'clock on either our Facebook page or our YouTube channel. You don't have to sign up for either. Just show up, click on the live feed and get questions ready for online. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you. Safe travels home. If anybody has any questions or comments, you can just send me an email, if you will.
I just had a quick question.
Yes.
You didn't speak to it, and maybe you're not prepared to, but molten salt thorium reactors, I see those as a real viable, it has huge potential.
The question is, yes, and in Europe, they're investing hundreds of millions of euros in hydrogen. So one of the big unknowns about transitions is, will they get us through?